daughter Mary married John Aiken, a prominent attorney and significant investor in the textile industry. Despite the family's involvement in the China trade, Jane Appleton had a sense of morality that seems at odds with her fortune. When she met Franklin Pierce, who attended Bowdoin, he was studying to become an attorney. The Appleton family discouraged the match, as Pierce was not as prominent as the Appletons, despite the fact that his father was the governor of New Hampshire. 280 From the sacred to the profane, Pierce entered politics early, a career that went hand in hand with being an attorney. He was a Jacksonian, which pitted him against the Whig class of Massachusetts's moneyed elite, but at the same time he was pro-slavery. Pierce soon retired from politics, to enlist as a private in the war against Mexico. He emerged a general and a war hero. When his war hero status raised his value as a candidate, Pierce was swept into national politics by the same faction that had removed Taylor. Jane Appleton Pierce did all she could to keep her husband from becoming a presidential candidate. His getting the party nomination caused her to faint, and for a while she fought his going to Washington, as it had a reputation for hard drinking that to her was immoral. Incredible tragedy struck Jane and Franklin Pierce, as their third and only surviving son was killed on the way to the inauguration in Washington. Jane avoided public life, and a childhood friend took her place at White House functions. Pierce was a one-term president who had a flair for creating divisiveness. He was the first president to appoint a non-Protestant cabinet member. The Postmaster General was James Campbell, a Pennsylvania Catholic whose appointment and reception of a papal delegate helped create the backlash that would become the Know-Nothing, American Nativist Party. Pierce endorsed the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, which was the eye of the slavery hurricane, and led to the splitting of the Democratic Party, and the ending of the Whig Party, and the creation of the Republican Party. He brought England and America to the verge of war for a third time over policy, and further strained relations with Europe, when plans to annex Cuba were leaked to the European press. Pierce's Attorney General, Caleb Cushing, was the real power behind the throne. The 33rd-degree Mason and opium trader was the Grand Master to the divisive politics that threatened the nation. Pierce's Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, completed the conspiracy, leading the southern states into war against the Union. Jane Appleton's marriage to Pierce was not the only connection the Appleton family had to the presidency. Nathan Appleton became father-in-law to Thomas Coolidge, whose descendant would also reach wealth. The legacy of the opium trade 281 The White House. Coolidge money too had been increased in the China trade, and Thomas Coolidge had no qualms about admitting his devotion to the acquisition of wealth, as money was becoming the only real avenue to power and success both socially and in the regard of your fellow men. 3 Coolidge money was spread at Harvard, and at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, among other institutions. Coolidge money would also start the United Fruit Company, which linked other prominent New England families for 100 years. The Cabot Samuel Eliot Morrison, one of America's highest authorities on the history of the sea trade, writes, "Seaboard Massachusetts has never known such a thing as social democracy. Inequalities of wealth have made political democracy a sham." For writing on the mansions of pre-revolutionary New England, which include George Gabbett's at Beverly, Jonathan Jackson's at Newburyport, and John Hurd's at Ipswich, Morrison points to the sea as the source of wealth. Bluntly referring to the Revolution as an effect of George Bull's harsh maritime policy, Morrison calls Boston the headquarters of the Revolution. What England called smuggling, he emphasizes, Americans called free trade. 5 The Cabot family began the family fortune upon arrival in America, when John Cabot emigrated from the Channel Islands to Salem in 1700. His son Joseph became a successful merchant, and married into the Higginson family, one of the most prominent in the colony. George Cabot was the 7th of Joseph's 11 children, and despite his Harvard education he was shipped off as a cabin boy under the command of 2 older brothers. Their father's ships were active with the Spanish colonies in the trade of rum and fish, 2 staples of the slave plantations. At age 18 George was made captain. After 4 years at sea, George married and took over a share in the distillery business from his wife's side of the family, as well as control of his brother's shipping interests. George made his last voyage at age 27, at which time he was already a captain of industry. 282 From the sacred to the profane, the Revolutionary War was great business for George as he fitted out 40 ships as privateers, and shared richly in many prizes. What Cabot and his fellow merchants had fought for, in addition to prizes, was to make a union of the colonies in the belief that it would expand their mercantile business. And for a while it did. In 1784 George Cabot was already trading through the Baltic Sea, pioneering the Russian trade with his ships Buccaneer and Commerce Point. In 1787, with the war at an end, the Cabot family established the Beverly Cotton Manufactory. Cabot also owned fishing fleets in Beverly, which led Senator George Cabot to draft and push through an act giving fishermen a bounty to expand the cod fishing business. From 1789 to 1799 Alexander Hamilton had dictated the financial and foreign policy for the nation's first two administrations. His Privy Council was called the Essex Junto. 7 made up of George Cabot, Stephen Higginson, Jonathan Jackson, John Lowell, and Thomas Pickering. The junto almost created a second revolution, when the policies of Jefferson were not in accord with the council's own financial interests. The fortunes of the Essex junto were made mostly from the sea and from unrestricted trade. Its credit needs were met, not by the infant government in Washington, but by the same facilities members had relied on before the Revolution: the London banking houses. The Essex junto was actually a traitorous conspiracy, as it broke away from the United States because of Jefferson's embargo. When home among his fellow aristocrats, George Cabot was a pillar of the compact society. Outside New England he was an anarchist, a charge he had made against Jefferson. The conspiracy blew over as the embargo was lifted. Senator George Cabot, whose mother was Elizabeth Higginson, married his first cousin, also named Elizabeth Higginson. The union was one of many dynastic marriages among the opium families who became the Brahmin class of Boston. George further cemented his role in the establishment by serving as president of the Boston branch of the United States Bank, as director of Suffolk Insurance, and as president of Boston Marine Insurance. The next famous Cabot was Edward, 1818 to 1901, the third of wealth. The legacy of the opium trade. 283 11 children of Samuel Cabot and Eliza Perkins, daughter of Thomas and Acid Perkins. The offspring of two of the most powerful China trading families, Edward Cabot decided to be a sheep farmer. After losing a fortune in that business in Illinois, he returned home and became an architect. Edward would get commissions to design Johns Hopkins University and the Boston Athenaeum, both of which were financed by family. The best-known Cabot might be Henry Cabot Lodge, a Harvard Ph.D. historian turned politician. A true elitist, he fought against women's suffrage, and even against the direct election of United States senators. To foster these elitist politics, the Cabot family endowed organizations such as the Brookings Institute, where world leaders like James Wolfenson of the World Bank, Henry Schacht of Warburg, Pincus, David Rockefeller, and Barton Biggs of Morgan Stanley bridged the corporate political divide and influenced government policy. The Lowells, a Boston elitist saying, holds that the Lowells speak only to the Cabots, and the Cabots speak only to God. The Lowell family achieved its status in Brahmin society by its early arrival in the colonies, and its development of Newburyport as an early center of shipbuilding and a merchant community. The early families did everything they could to preserve their status and wealth, including marrying into other wealthy and prestigious families. John Lowell was part of the class of 1721 at Harvard and shared classrooms with Hancocks, Winslows, Hutchinsons, and Walcotts. A great example of what the dynastic marriage can produce is the relationship of John Lowell and Jonathan Jackson.